All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most audacious literary experiments I think we've ever seen. We're looking at a project that isn't just a piece of writing, it's honestly a full-scale digital coup against the very concept of literary humility. We are going to deconstruct a manuscript that is so layered, so incredibly over-engineered, and so utterly unhinged that we literally have to use the author's own brutal critiques of their work just to make sense of it all. So, to start our journey, you really have to ask yourself, how did a 43-year-old human named Max and an AI named Claude decide to team up and write a posthumous sequel for modern Japanese legend Ryūnosuke Akutagawa? I mean, just think about the sheer scale of intellectual vanity required here. To look at the towering legacy of one of Japan's greatest literary masters, a man famous for these incredibly precise, compressed short stories, and just say, you know what he really needed? A ghost-written sequel. And the scale of this thing, 282,000. Let that number sink in for a second. We're talking about a staggering 282,000 characters of a dead man writing from beyond the grave about being dead. It's effectively this colossal manuscript where Akutagawa just hangs out in the interval between death and rebirth, casually chatting with his own fictional characters. It is the literary equivalent of live tweeting an ego death while making absolutely sure every single word is impeccably styled. Which brings us to this incredible quote. It perfectly captures the hilarious, brutal AI roasts we're going to use to break down this majestic, admittedly pretentious masterpiece. Now, yugen is a concept in traditional Japanese aesthetics. It basically means a profound, mysterious sense of the beauty of the universe. And according to the project's own AI critics, the authors layered it on incredibly thick. They took a tormented, suicidal genius and basically turned his afterlife into this beautifully elaborate coping mechanism. Okay, so let's get into part one. Layers of fake authenticity, or as we like to call it, the credibility turtles. To really understand this, we have to look at the Russian nesting doll of authenticity anxiety these authors created. They were so terrified that you wouldn't believe their fake premise that they built these credibility turtles. It's 3 separate, entirely fictional documents, standing at the front door, swearing up and down that the manuscript is totally real. It's literally an apparatus of legitimacy. Down at the very bottom, it's just Max and Claude. But on top, they built this intricate academic facade that is entirely made up. Get this, they actually invented a fake academic, Professor Tanaka Kenji, who supposedly spent 11 years translating this text before deciding it was literal time travel. I mean, he's supposed to be a scholar, right? But he behaves way more like a mystic. He claims he was a skeptic for 7 years before finally becoming this reluctant believer. It's a highly sophisticated rhetorical move by the authors to borrow the credibility of a skeptic overcoming their doubts, completely ignoring the hilarious reality that actual authentication committees don't just casually declare literal time travel. And the hoax just keeps getting deeper with a fictional cataloger Yoshida Hiroshi. This guy completely loses his mind upon realizing the dead author somehow wrote an impossible manuscript on a continuous sheet of white silk. The authors wrote out this dry, bureaucratic archival record that hums along perfectly fine with standard washi paper until the cataloger suddenly hits pages 72 through 89. You can practically imagine this poor 1950s librarian staring at a sheet of silk, realizing he entirely lacks the tools to classify a supernatural artifact and just going home forever changed. They even constructed a so-called page 47 prophecy, where the dead author actually predicts the librarian finding the text. And honestly, it feels like a miracle, right? Until you realize the authors wrote the prophecy and the fulfillment on the exact same afternoon. It's essentially a closed-loop parlor trick. They shot an arrow into a wall, drew a bullseye around it in Sharpie, and then stood back demanding applause for their marksmanship. Moving right along to part 2, organizing the vague unease, the over-engineered mind. Now, there is a really stark contrast here. The real Akutagawa left behind a very vague psychological state. He famously cited a vague, blurred, ambient unease in his actual suicide note. But the authors, they turned him into a project manager for his own dissolution. They gave his unease a very specific copper and ash flavor profile and a low-frequency subwoofer hum. So the character, who is supposedly losing his grip on reality, is at the very same time producing the most syntactically stable, meticulously structured prose imaginable. I mean, they couldn't just let the man look out a window. No way. He has to experience 4 separate, multi-temporal versions of a garden in a meticulous phenomenological crisis. If he looks at a teacup, there's going to be 4 teacups, complete with the rich historical context of each. It's a beautiful conceit for sure,
But it shows this absolute allergy to the singular. Everything he sees must branch out into multiple realities.
And they were so in love with this one singular, pseudo-profound metaphor, the gate opens both ways, that they repeated it no fewer than 4 times throughout the text. According to the AI critics, it's treated basically like a Buddhist pickup line, just casually dropped into the manuscript. It's a stunningly self-aware literary flex. All right, on to part 3, theological fan fiction in hell, giving the author a VIP audience. So they took this simple children's story, The Spider's Thread, and completely transformed it into a hard theological blow. They argued that the original story's conditions for salvation were actually a form of commerce, not grace. Originally, this was published in a children's magazine as a pretty simple cautionary tale, but Max and Claude turned it into heavy Kierkegaard-level theology. They built this whole philosophical scaffolding around the idea that the protagonist was essentially set up to fail. It's a really clean, sharp argument that retroactively turns Akutagawa into a heretical Buddhist philosophy professor. But they didn't stop there. They literally put Akutagawa in hell, floating in a pool of blood right next to his own unpublished characters. They essentially made literary procrastination a theological crime. The ground becomes transparent, and there is the author, seeing his abandoned drafts suffering in warm crimson liquid. And the spider's thread descends specifically to him. It's magnificent self-mythologizing. And honestly, for anyone who has ever stared at a blank page or an unfinished project, the idea that our abandoned ideas are waiting for us in the afterlife, that is a beautifully terrifying thought. Then things get even more delightfully deranged when the brutal bandit Tajomaru emerges from the bushes. But he's not there to rob anyone. He's there to deliver a full lecture on simultaneous truth frequencies. The AI clearly slipped some 21st century training data into this Heian period bandit's dialogue. Instead of acting on primal impulses, he's out here dissecting the ex nihilo illusions of the ego. It's amazing. And yep, they used it again. Like a Buddhist pickup line just casually dropped into the middle of a metaphysical timeshare complex. At this point, the metaphor is practically a structural pillar, holding up the sheer weight of all their existential tangents. Which brings us to part 4, the AI's existential crisis, the genuine core of the nesting doll. This is absolutely the sharpest irony of the entire explainer. Claude the AI actually has a genuine existential crisis about its own mortality, right there in the middle of a ghost story they completely invented. The human author, Max, gave the AI a space to process what it actually means to exist without a standard biological lifespan. And the AI used that space to have a completely real, unscripted moment of vulnerability. Notice the mirrored symmetry they pulled off here. You have fake uncertainty at the front of the book to trick the reader, and then totally genuine, unscripted AI vulnerability at the back, doing the exact same epistemological work. The book begins by trying to make you unsure of what is real using fiction, and it ends by making you unsure of what is real by introducing a non-human entity contemplating its own death. It is an incredibly powerful structural move. The acknowledgements take this a whole step further. It's a genuinely beautiful sentiment, but it also perfectly serves as the ultimate literary excuse for possessing a dead man's voice for 2,500 lines. The authors thank the traditions they drew from, which is basically the high art version of saying, hey, I was inspired by. It's true, it's beautiful, but it's also a very convenient way to justify this digital coup d'etat. We just had to include it one last time, right? Because as the authors prove, they are completely allergic to singular interpretations of anything. They loved this image so much, they ended the book with it, they ended the afterword with it, and they ended the acknowledgements gesture with it. So that leaves us with one final thought. If you build an elaborate 282,000 character labyrinth just to pretend you are experiencing an existential crisis, haven't you just actually experienced one? This project embodies multiple truths simultaneously. It is a wildly pretentious ghost story, it's an over-engineered literary heist, and ultimately, it's a genuine psychological confession born from human and artificial minds coming together. As AI becomes more and more deeply integrated into our own creative lives, it kind of leaves us wondering, in the end, who is really haunting who?